to get in touch with your feelings and to begin to share that with your family while you're still healthy
Hmm.
is the best way to begin to prepare yourself for what's ahead. And there's some tremendous resources. There's a
One. Hey everybody, Ken from Home Instead here. Welcome to Home Instead Chats. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Today, my guest is Barak Wolf. Barak has had a long and varied career with the New Mexico Department of Health. He's now mostly retired, although he continues to serve as an analyst for the state Senate when they are in full session. Over the last 9 years, Barak has gotten deeply involved in end-of-life issues, and he was a founding member of the New Mexico End-of-Life Options Coalition. The Elizabeth Whitefield End-of-Life Options Act was signed into law by our state governor, Lujan Grisham, on April 8th. And this law will provide New Mexicans living with terminal illnesses more choices and options around how they desire to live out their final days. Barak will now serve on the initial board of a new nonprofit that's being created called End of Life Options New Mexico to help implement the new law. And I brought Barak on today to have a chat with him about end of life planning, how he found himself in this role of advocacy and education, and whatever else might come up. So thanks for joining me, Barak. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken, and a good introduction. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I've been very excited to have this chat with you. I've already let you know a bit about this, but albeit from a less knowledgeable space personally. I mean, what we do with Home Instead definitely has us, providing care and support for people all the way up into the end of life, being part of the hospice team and working alongside them. I personally have had many years that I spent in ministry where I, was with a lot of families during times when their loved ones were close to passing, and even at the moment of their passing. And I'm very interested personally in every stage of life, all the way up to and including, the time of our death. I think it's very important to think about these things, and living a good life, living an examined life, all the way through is something I think a lot about. So I've been excited to have this chat with you. Tell me how you found yourself. First off, maybe tell us a little bit about how you found yourself in the role that you played within the Department of Health for so many years, and then how that road led you to these years later, working with and being so passionate about issues surrounding end of life.
Well, again, a lovely and easy question to get into. You get to talk about yourself a little. So thank you. But I actually had my graduate training in public health and public health administration. So I got a sense of how the health system is supposed to work and how it did or didn't work. And this goes back a long ways, as you can tell from my graying hair and whatever. But when I got out here to New Mexico in 1975, I started working with rural health all over the state, clinics, National Health Service Corps, working with small communities, helping create clinics for doctors and dentists. So I got to know the people of the state a bit. I got to get a sense of that, and also working with the challenge of establishing healthcare. I did that for 4 or 5 years, and then started to work back with the New Mexico Department of Health in a role that, again, took me into the rural areas. I became the Director of Emergency Medical Services. And there's nothing more grassroots than the EMTs around the state, many of them volunteers, less so perhaps today than it used to be, because we've made a lot of progress in the last 40 years. But EMS is a grassroots emergency delivery system that moves people to where they need to be, and then some, because now they're involved in immunizations and a bunch of other things that tie them more closely to public health. So
Hmm.
I did that for 20 plus years and then had the opportunity to become the director of public health for a number of years as part of the Department of Health. In New Mexico, we have a statewide system. So it was a large job and I loved doing it. I learned a lot. And ultimately, though, that was a position that you served at the governor's pleasure. And we had a change, and the new governor wasn't his pleasure. So I essentially had an early retirement. And
Wow.
that's what led me to the opportunity to explore other possibilities. I was still a youngish man. Um, and I was always very taken with the political process. And again, things worked out. I've been very blessed to have a very good career here in New Mexico, to where the Senate Public Affairs Committee needed a new analyst that year. And I knew the legislator who chaired it. And so she hired me, and for the last 17 years, for either 30 days or 60 days, I serve that committee, analyzing bills, helping schedule them, doing research for the legislators, and also having the opportunity to look back and be helpful to people in EMS, to people in public health, as they go through their legislative process.
Hmm.
So in that regard, I'm a little bit of a legislative insider, but just as a staffer, not as a politician, but as a staffer. So I've had this, again, very wonderful, rich career here in New Mexico, and still get to play at it. And then you asked about, well, how did you move from that in your retirement to thinking about end of life issues? Well,
Yeah.
I had thought for a number of years that if and as I retired, that working with senior issues might be something I'd be interested in. I am one, and I knew I would be one. And so
Hmm.
part of it is sort of self-serving, but I kind of thought I'd be more on the administrative side of sort of healthy aging and public health approach, and looking at options for communal living, and a lot of which goes on and is very necessary and is great work. But for some reason, my inclination, and it may have been from some volunteer work back in the 90s I did with HIV patients, where I learned a lot about death and dying. And we certainly had way too much death and dying of young people. And I got involved in that just as a support person, and tended some deaths. And I found it all very compelling. And so as I really looked at retirement and got to a point where I wasn't doing other work, I knew that I wanted to gravitate. And that was right when there was a court case here in New Mexico about this medical aid in dying. Maybe it's not against the law, is what the court case said. Maybe it's not assisting suicide or whatever. And I got involved saying, I could be helpful if you ever have to go to the legislature with that. And I started learning about it and getting involved with like-minded people here in New Mexico who were working those issues. And I do find it obviously very compelling and still very self-serving. And I'll end with this. I've been very blessed to have a very positive, wonderful career and a positive life. We all have our challenges every day, but I count my blessings every day. And I want to be sure that I'm in a position to try and have that good death. And a good death to me is whatever you want it to be. And we'll get back to that a little bit later as we talk about self-determination and advanced care planning.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the motivation. And the more I listened and read and watched and read and talked to people, I realized that this was an area that really captured my interest and that we had a lot of work to do. Because a lot of people get caught up and don't exercise the kinds of proactive choices that the law entitles them to. So let me stop there. That's plenty about me, and go ahead and see what your next one is.
Oh, I love it. You've done so much, so accomplished. You've impacted so many lives in all those different spheres. I'm sure in all the years that you've been working, specifically with end of life issues, I'm sure you've come across a lot of stories of, real life stories that have impacted you in ways that have served to really spur you on and empower you even more in the work that you're doing of educating and advocating for this cause. Can you oh, can you give us an example of maybe something that you've seen, a story that you've heard that was an example of good end of life planning, even a good death, that
Yeah.
you referenced, that has served to, spur you on in this work you do?
Um, I think their stories are incredibly important in
Yeah.
many lines of work, but particularly this lends itself to the stories. And ultimately, I think that's why we were successful in the legislature, because as we would have a chance to provide testimony, people had stories, some of which were just elevated and transformational for those people and their families,
Hmm.
that it went well, and that their dying loved ones ultimately had their wishes fulfilled in terms of resolving issues with their family or being pain free and surrounded by loved ones. And it doesn't get any better than that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
if that's what you want. Um, but as often as not, there's stories of grief and isolation and disappointment and unresolved issues, as in our current system, um, the medical care system moves people towards life-saving care,
Hmm.
just as its default position tends to be that over the last 30 years, with our super intensive ICUs and our subspecialists. And God bless it all, because when we get our diagnosis initially for a cancer or a heart disease, we want to look at all options and we want all
Absolutely.
that treatment and want to survive that. Most people do. But on the other hand, at some point, those treatments just may not work as well. I mean, some people come out of it fine and have many years to live, but there's a lot of people that don't. And therefore, they can get caught up in issues of longevity that sometimes compromise the quality of their last months of life. And those are the kinds of choices that feel so important to those folks like myself who want to help the whole system work better and help individuals be knowledgeable about their choices. And that's really the essence of this end of life options movement, if you will. Um, it's not that there's a right answer, because there isn't. It's whatever it is that you want or what I want for myself. And that's not always the case in other parts of our lives, that we have this power. Doesn't always work out that way, but at least it gives us a fighting chance if we know what we'd like. So, again, there are many examples. You probably have some in your family and loved ones. I certainly did in mine. Um, uh, you know, uh, Not so much with my parents, although they had good passings, but with an older sister. But I think
Yeah.
most people who are listening can relate to the fact that some deaths are really positive experiences and some are not. And some of those that aren't could probably be improved. And that's what we're working towards.
Yeah, I think that's great. I might jump around here a bit because I asked you, I asked you for, maybe a story, and, maybe you didn't share a specific story, but you kind of did. I mean, you shared the story of all of us, because like in the bookends sense, and,
Right.
and and I think that, one of the things that we were talking before we started, the interview portion of our chat, about how just the conversation is healthy, because I think that, coming to terms with things and actually, um, you know actually there's a healthy aspect, I believe, to accepting the impermanence of things. And there's a beauty that can arise from that. There's a fear, that we have that, maybe there won't be beauty on the other side of accepting that. But,
Right.
you know, if we never get to a place where we can have the conversations about the difficult, the difficult conversations about death and our mortality, we're never going to be able to plan and have, like you said, we're never going to have a fighting chance at making a good plan
Yeah.
or having it turn out well. It's so that made me think about, the one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, since this is a space that you tend to live and work and think so much within, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on maybe why you think our culture in particular at this point in time seems so averse to speaking openly on the topic of mortality and death.
Yeah. Uh, Probably smarter than people than me would have to, think about what are some of the root causes of that shift. Because I think back in the older days when people were sort of around their homes and had extended families in their homes, so that auntie and grandma died in the home because we had generations sharing households or neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't send everybody to the hospital at the end of life because the hospitals didn't offer as much. So they tended to die at home. And it was just more familiar. The same with agrarian societies. They're used to seeing animals, get born, live their lives, and then die. And so there was that acceptance of the cycle of life that maybe in our sort of faster paced, more modern society, we've moved away from to a high degree and gotten separated from some of that comfort that, yeah, life is a cycle. I often say in my talks, I think I did in Doorways the other day, nobody gets out alive. I mean, we can be in denial all we want, but for me and for many people, just the understanding and talking out loud about it makes it easier to accept.
Yeah.
And I do understand, Ken, this sense of, gosh, I'm afraid if I talk about it, it's gonna make it happen. This sort of superstitious in a way,
Yeah.
or this that I don't want to bring it on myself by talking about it. Well, there's this wonderful quote by one of our, she calls herself the doyen of death. She's out of Albuquerque, and she's a humorist and a philosopher. And she talks about this stuff. And one of her mottos is that, as she urges people to be open to talking about death and dying, that, see, how does she say it? You don't get pregnant from talking about sex, and this is sort of similar, um, to get in touch with your feelings and to begin to share that with your family while you're still healthy
Mm-hmm.
is the best way to begin to prepare yourself for what's ahead. And there's some tremendous resources. There's a whole website and booklets put out by this Conversation Project, they call it, the conversationproject.org, that has prided itself in developing really user-friendly materials to help people figure out how to have these difficult conversations in ways that aren't so threatening to anybody involved. And it's a knack that you develop over time if you care to.
Yeah.
Again, it's fine not to. And some people say, whatever comes, comes, and I don't want to control that part. I'm open and respectful of whatever the take is. But if you want to have some control, then the sooner you start thinking about it a little bit and talking about it, and then you can put it away for a while and then come back to it as we age, because our thoughts will change, as they should, as we get infirmities, as we maybe have a serious diagnosis. Perhaps that's the time that some folks will get more serious in thinking about, what are my treatment options and what are the risk benefits? And do I want to try this chemical chemotherapy or this radiation? The doctor says it might get me a little extra time, but at what cost? If people can assess for themselves that trade-off between longevity and quality of remaining life. And in our society, we're fortunate that we have this right to self-determination. All states have it, feds have it, where we get to choose when and what to start in the way of treatments and when to stop them if they're not working for us. We can either try something else or say, you know what, I'm done, I'm ready. And then we have this wonderful hospice um, development over the last 30 years, where it's paid for and it has robust support of all kinds. And it's really comfort care. It's helping people stay comfortable as they basically live full and good lives right up to the end. So that's my sense of it, that the conversations are really important if you want to have them.
Yeah.
And we would urge you to have them, because then you don't worry as much and you don't get as fearful. And to me, that's the hardest part, when people approach death with lots of fear and unresolved issues and uncertainties.
Hmm.
And that maybe ties back to a little bit more about the options at end of life that we could talk about.
Yeah. So, speaking of resources, you mentioned the Conversation Project, but something that comes up a lot in our circles that we run in is the New Mexico MOST form. And I was thinking it would be great if you could touch on that and talk a little bit about what the form is, what kind of tool it is, what it is, what it isn't,
Right.
and let folks know how they can obtain it. Because as I understand it, I mean, it's at the very least a good starting point for thinking through what our actual wishes might be, and giving some direction to those
Right.
around us.
It's I would take a little exception to that, Ken, that it's actually, in most cases, we'd rather have it a little bit further down the line than a starting point.
Okay.
And let me explain that. And first of all, I'm going to hold this up uh, because you got to see this lime green color, even though it may be coming out in reverse. But it's a two-sided. This one's on a heavy stock. It's lime green. That's in other states it's different, but this is what was chosen for New Mexico. And there's a terrific website. It's very simple to negotiate and to look at. It's NMMOST, MOST, NMMOST.org. Couldn't be simpler. And it'll take you to where you could download the form and just be on regular paper. But you can also get a nice explanation, both for families and patients, but also for providers. There's a section on the website. No cost involved on any of it. There's no strong requirement or legal basis for it. But let me tell you what it does. The MOST form, we consider it in New Mexico a form, a complement, if you will, to an advance directive. You know, an advance directive, you're generally saying, hopefully filling it out when you're feeling good, like you are today,
Hmm.
and say, boy, if I get injured or if I get ill, here's what I think I would want. This is what's meaningful to me. Here's my values. Here's who I would like to appoint to represent me. Those are the components of an advance directive. This drills down a little bit more. We really say that the MOST form is really used for those who are seriously ill, or sort of have a prospect of dying in the not too far future. But when you get an initial diagnosis and start treatment, that's a time to take a look at the MOST form, because it drills down in a way that is more detailed, and you're correct, than an advance directive in most cases. It's also more powerful because it is a medical order. That's what it stands for. It's the New Mexico Medical Order for Scope of Treatment. And those are the words. MOST is Medical Order for Scope of Treatment. And that's why it's a form that you would fill out with your primary provider, because you would be talking about the specific condition that you acknowledge and he acknowledges that you're dealing with now. And so that you can tailor your decisions about, okay, if you're still living at home and you have a MOST form and you want to post that so that if there's an emergency and an EMT gets called to the house, they will see the form and look at it and verify, that it's you, and then respect what you put on that form in terms of whether or not you might want CPR started or not, whether or not you want to be transported to the hospital, whether or not they should start either in the field in your home, or when they get to the hospital, should they start an IV for fluids? If it's a massive infection, do you want to start treating that infection with antibiotics or not? Those are the kinds of conversations that you would have with your provider,
Mm-hmm.
where it's not the provider saying, oh, you should do this. It's the provider talking about your options and the implications of those options so that you both can fill out the form and sign it. So this is a form then that is recognized in the assisted living facility, in long-term care, and certainly in the home as a way to get towards the hospital through the emergency department if need be. Ultimately, by the time you get hospitalized, they will put this in your record and you can actually have this in your record, but then their forms will take over generally and you will have what they call the do not resuscitate form, if that's your choice. Or fine, let's resuscitate. Again, you'll need to reiterate these choices as you go through the process. But this is an initial form, and on the back, you can also identify your healthcare decision maker so that you can, that's why in New Mexico, we think of it like an addendum to an advanced directive.
Uh-huh.
And whichever is the most recently signed is the one that people look at and follow, at least hypothetically. Because we expect that people will do these as their conditions change, as their problems change. So it's not a one-time shot. It's something that you would do and then do again in a year or two, depending on whether you've gotten worse or better or what else has happened to you. So that's really the form. It's really for those who are seriously ill, not for a young, healthy person like yourself.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to have this chat with me. For anyone who might have maybe questions or they would like to reach out to you about information, regarding end-of-life options, New Mexico, and the work that you've been doing, how would folks reach out to you? And is there anything else that you would like to share with those who might be listening?
Well, just very quickly, because again, in this setting, in a quick interview, we don't talk about what are those options. But there's a couple of websites that I could mention. And again, I don't know exactly how you send this out, or people could write it down. There's a marvelous national organization called Compassion and Choices, and they've been doing this kind of work for many years. And their website, compassionandchoices.org, is excellent and has just enormous tools and information and fact sheets about all that we've talked about. Certainly, here in Santa Fe, I'm a resource. And again, my name is Barak, B-A-R-A-K, Wolf, W-O-L-F-F. So Barak Wolf at msn.com. Shoot me an email. I'm real good on them and I'll try and be helpful. We also have a pretty good website for our End of Life New Mexico. If you Google that, End of Life NM, it'll take you to our website. Now, right now, we're in transition because we're moving from advocacy into being a resource and a support to the implementation of the new medical aid in dying law. But eventually, hopefully sooner than later, we'll have quite a bit of information about all the end-of-life options, including medical aid in dying. There's a lot of resources out there, but it is tough stuff. And you have to, it takes energy and thoughtfulness, but it's also a way that you can move towards hopefully having the kind of death that you want. And that's pretty good.
Thanks so much, Barak. I appreciate the work that you do, and everything that you've advocated for, everything you've accomplished, and then also in just keeping, and just bringing these types of conversations. This chat that you and I are having is fruit of it, and I think it's healthy. It's healthy. It's good for me. I appreciate it. I definitely I don't want to shy away from thinking about these things, and I think that that's best for us in the course of our lives. And yeah, thank you for having this chat with me this afternoon. And I will put all that information that you gave in the show notes so that people will just be able to scroll down and click it. So if you're watching and you're interested in checking out any of those websites, you can just scroll down and click the link in the show notes. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, Barak, and I'll see you soon.
Absolutely. Down the road. You betcha. Thank you, Ken.